All right, so tonight I'm going to talk about gentrification in Brooklyn in the 2010s decade because it's another big topic when discussing Brooklyn in that decade, okay, in the 2010s. So let's start with a definition, okay? Like I said, I really don't do research for this podcast. I'm talking about my experiences as I saw them as somebody who was either living or was in Brooklyn all the time from about 2009 to 2019. I Googled gentrification, and this was the first result I got. The process whereby the character of a poor urban area is changed by wealthier people moving in, improving housing, and attracting new businesses, typically displacing current inhabitants in the process. So that was the definition. You can Google it and probably find it yourself. And I'd agree with that definition. I think that's what a lot of people would agree it is. There'd be some variations. This is a very touchy topic, and it was a very, very big topic, not just among people who covered Brooklyn as journalists or writers, but by people who were living in Brooklyn themselves, because it affected the borough a lot, probably more than other parts of New York City. So it was it was already a topic way before I even started going to Brooklyn. I started hearing about it when I was working in New York City in the early 2000s, mid 2000s. I heard about it from people who were talking about Brooklyn or who lived in Brooklyn. And you'd often hear about it from people talking about neighborhoods like Williamsburg, and then you heard about it in Bed-Stuy, in Bushwick. Basically, what I'd hear is wow, people, young people. Often that was what people would say. They're moving to Bed-Stuy now. They're moving to Bushwick because these neighborhoods still had the label of being dangerous, of not being places that people would want to move to. And maybe in past years, even in the 90s, they had been places where people would move to, but more out of like some kind of necessity, like they could not afford Manhattan, or they just were trying to live out that New York City dream, and there was nowhere else to go, they felt. But by 2004, 2005, you're hearing about people actually wanting to move there. Okay, so I was hearing about it by that time, and then when I was going to Brooklyn all the time, pretty much every week by 2009, 2010, I was starting to see the process as it was really rapidly happening in Williamsburg. All right, so by 2010, Williamsburg had pretty much become gentrified already, where you had the whole neighborhood was well, the area on the waterfront, you could say, by that time was transformed. It was a destination. It was someplace people wanted to go for nightlife and wanted to move there, wanted to be a part of the art scene, the restaurant scene, the nightclub scene. It had already happened. The music scene too. Okay? So that had already happened in Williamsburg, and there were a lot of new buildings going up all the time throughout the decade that were catering to people wanting to move there. So this changed the look of the neighborhood because previously it had been buildings that were very old, maybe 80 to 100, maybe even older than that. Okay, so it was replaced by newer looking buildings. So sometimes the old and the new were right next to each other, but for sure, a lot of new buildings were going up. Okay, and first they were, I would say, they were like 2 or 3 stories, but they became much bigger towers by the end of the decade. Okay, so huge towers were going up, especially on the waterfront, Wythe Avenue, Kent Avenue, by the end of the decade. Some of the older factories were repurposed. I think there was one called the Pencil Factory. It was like North Third and Kent Avenue, right on the waterfront. There was, of course, the Domino uh, building. I don't think that was repurposed yet into apartments by the end of the decade, but was being used for other things. I think artist Jeff Koons had a big show there, and of course the park nearby. So the look of Williamsburg, it became like the waterfront just was unrecognizable by the end of the decade. It just really just lost a lot of its industrial character with these new bright buildings going up, and they brought just a, as they went up, just a more professional class, less of the independent artists, musicians, creative types. So this really happened. That's and I speak about it in my other podcast about Williamsburg. So that was really where I first saw this gentrification move on, and then of course, the businesses nearby were catering, Whole Foods and other. It was like Urban Market or something like that right there. Um, Vegan places, doggy daycares. Places for children, because now the people that were moving in were older or more established, or the people who had been there before grew up and now they're older, more established, having kids and families, and that's where it was like just really transformed. The gentrification happened, and um, it it traveled because Brooklyn was so hot. It was such a destination in that decade that it spread, and it spread nearby to Greenpoint. So Greenpoint, I'll probably do a podcast just about Greenpoint in the future, but that was actually where I lived for about 8 years, and Greenpoint had, like Williamsburg, been a working class neighborhood, except Greenpoint was primarily Polish, as far as I know. Everything I heard about it was that it was the Polish neighborhood, and it had a very industrial character as well, because that part of Brooklyn, North Brooklyn, had very good transportation links to Manhattan, to Queens. Okay, so there was bridges there. There was the highway, the BQE, Brooklyn Queens Expressway. It had a very large industrial area, and so the as Brooklyn just kept, like, crime kept going down throughout the decade. Homicides were down. You saw the decline of organized crime, and people just kept moving in. It was Brooklyn was all over TV, was and TV shows, girls, etc. So I first went to Greenpoint around 2005, and 2010. It still had a lot of the Polish character to it, businesses, restaurants, and after 2015, basically it changed a lot too, and it took on a lot of the character of Williamsburg, with new buildings going up, more professional people moving in. Um, and what else? The main thoroughfare changed, just like in Williamsburg. Bedford Avenue changed a lot. Um, so did Nassau Avenue. From what I heard from people in the Polish community, a lot of them moved to parts of Queens or just moved possibly away from the city, but definitely away from Greenpoint unless they had owned property. So I saw it happen in Greenpoint, and then Bushwick was kind of seen as the frontier of gentrification. As I mentioned in my podcast just about Bushwick, I would say by the end of the decade, it was kind of mixed. You had kind of a mix of the old and the new, but for sure, a lot of the character of Bushwick was different by the end of the decade. It took on a different look. It didn't become as much a professional class of people by the end of the decade, but it for sure changed. So you could say Bushwick didn't really become gentrified in the same way that Williamsburg and Greenpoint did. It still retained a lot of the independent artists and creative types. So that's where you could possibly debate on the definition of gentrification. Bushwick for sure didn't look like Williamsburg or Greenpoint. Then we also have where else did gentrification happen? For sure in Bed-Stuy. So I'll probably do a podcast just about Bed-Stuy as well, but Bed-Stuy is near Williamsburg. It's one of the adjacent neighborhoods, and that would be on the south side of Williamsburg. It borders it. So that had been a primarily African American neighborhood, black neighborhood, and what Bed-Stuy had was a lot of what are called brownstones, and these are, I'd say, usually 2 to 3 story buildings that were built many years ago, and they're called brownstones because they're often covered in this brown colored coating that's put on the outside of them. They always have this certain certain look to them, but they're very historic buildings, and they were built at a time where different time period, and they're nice buildings, especially if you like a classical look. I've been in many of them, worked in many of them, visited many friends in them. They would typically have like high ceilings, wood floors, a lot of woodwork in them, and they were spacious too. Often, from what I remember, a lot of old moldings and things like that. So anyway, many of them had fallen into disrepair, or just in the 70s and 80s, Bed-Stuy was just a place people did not move to. I believe it also had higher crime like Bushwick. But once the gentrification of Williamsburg happened and crime was way down, these brownstones became very desirable. I would often get called to work in them, to fix them up, renovate them as a contractor, and that was happening throughout the decade. I remember once I even got called by a bank, which was buying up brownstones, I believe, and they were getting into the business of renovating them and selling them. And I was hearing about big price tags going for these properties. So, and the people buying them were more professional class of people. Also, you had some of what was going on in Bushwick, going on in Bed-Stuy, where creative types were moving into brownstones that were being rented out, or other buildings in Bed-Stuy that were being rented out. So, Bed-Stuy, I would say, ended the decade kind of like Bushwick, where the neighborhood retained a lot of its older character, but was also changed by gentrification. So, where else did you have gentrification in Brooklyn? It was definitely in other parts, downtown Brooklyn, the waterfront, the area called Dumbo, down under the Manhattan Bridge overpass. I had heard from people that it was not really changing. It was still similar to what it had been as far as like the early 2000s. But definitely when I started going over there for work, by the in the 2010s, it had changed a lot. So Front Street, those areas right near the waterfront, a lot of the old buildings, they had been just changed already. They had been, a lot of them from what I remember, had been repurposed. Also, a lot of new towers had gone up. Brooklyn Bridge Park, which I believe was built, like, it's just a beautiful, beautiful park. Like, I guess it was 2015, 2016, around that time. That I mean, that whole neighborhood for sure. I believe it was mostly industrial before, and it had really been changed. Uh, Downtown Brooklyn. Um, where else? Park Slope. I believe Park Slope is another brownstone neighborhood, and it had already been known as a place for like academics, intellectuals, professional people for a while already. Maybe as far as the 80s. I don't know. I don't know too much about it, but for sure the neighborhoods around it, like the South Park Slope, Gowanus, these areas were also affected by a lot of the same trends that were going on in Williamsburg and Greenpoint, to varying extents. You have the area around the Brooklyn Navy Yard. I remember that around like 2005 was still very industrial, and that had declined a lot by the end of the 2010s. Um, and that's Sunset Park also. When you used to drive down the BQE, you would pass Sunset Park, which we're now saying is a neighborhood next to Park Slope. So that had been a area full of warehouses by the BQE, and then I believe it was in the early 2010s, these warehouses have been converted into something called Industry City, which was supposed to be like places that was going to have light industry, I believe, maybe, and other markets, and a lot of, I believe, big retailers started moving in. So Sunset Park also changed to some extent, although mostly you would see, when I was there, I guess it was kind of like a little bit like Bushwick with creative types moving in to some extent, but was still mostly a Chinese and Mexican, other Hispanics living there. This is kind of like, you could say, was the frontier of gentrification that was going on, was probably around Sunset Park, by the end of the decade, at least at that part of Brooklyn. Now you also had Crown Heights too, somewhat similar. I guess on that side of Brooklyn was kind of like the frontier of gentrification by the end of the decade. Still mostly, I would say, retained its character with mostly African American and Hasidic Jewish character to the neighborhood. So what you see is that gentrification was a big trend, and it was so rapid. So originally, gentrification was associated with a lot of the younger, mostly whiter, racially more college educated, creative types moving in the 2000s and the early part of the 2010s, and then by the end of the 2010s, it was often used to describe the more professional class, sometimes displacing not only the people who had lived in these neighborhoods for decades, but they were seen as displacing the creative types as well. So it was just so rapid and so strong throughout the decade that you could say that the definition of gentrification changed somewhat, where the artists, the musicians were seen as being displaced, and to some extent they were, and their businesses were displaced. So it was, you could say, it was kind of ironic that some of the people that started this trend were the ones that ended up being displaced by it. And I witnessed that as to some extent. I saw it. I knew people who were affected in that way. I also knew people who benefited from that. That people I knew who were in the crafts, in the trades, in the arts. They their clientele was the wealthier people who were moving in, and I know that was true with my business. So in that way, gentrification was a really controversial thing. It was a big issue and a very controversial issue because now here's one thing too that I saw, and I wouldn't say that this was widespread, but some of the people who had stayed in Brooklyn throughout the 70s and 80s and bought property, this was a gold mine for them. They could sell these properties for millions. And I know some who did. I knew people who had held on to what became prime real estate in Bed-Stuy, in Williamsburg, and they really were doing very well from it. So I saw that. And then as no one can doubt that the rents, the value of properties went way up throughout the 2010s in many parts of Brooklyn. Probably all parts of Brooklyn, but especially North and Central Brooklyn. And it made finding an apartment very difficult. And if you fell under, if you hit a rough spot, you were in trouble. And I know because that happened to me. It was just became very difficult to find lower rents, or you were going to have roommates or something like that, or you were going to have to do something fast because it was not going down. It was going way up throughout the decade. And so this led to a lot of controversial things, as I've said in other podcasts. Were these people moving in? Were they, were they? I mean, no doubt. Some of them were people who were very successful, and they wanted to live in Brooklyn, and the housing was going up to accommodate them. So, how this affected people who had been there for decades, that kind of depended on what your politics were, if you thought it was fair or not, if the gentrification was too rapid. And there were debates like this going on, but no doubt about it, the gentrification was very strong throughout the decade, and it kept going on, and new buildings were going up, fancier buildings, especially in Williamsburg, was kind of like, I would say, the epicenter of it. Um, that's what happened. I mean, to some extent, it was so rapid. I felt like I didn't want to live in New York anymore. I didn't want to deal with it. I had run into a lot of financial trouble. I had a business. It ultimately, I had to close it, and I was not in a good place financially. And I decided New York. I didn't. I'd rather not deal with it myself. And I believe a lot of other people left New York City for the same reason. but a lot kept moving in. So, um, is there anything else to say about gentrification? Uh, it's like the hipster. It's a controversial thing. It changed a lot of the businesses. I mean, you had just a lot of the people moving in. They were, they were into. It seemed like they were into health and fitness. So you had businesses that catered to them. A lot of, you had a lot more vegans who were moving in, vegetarians, so restaurants that would cater to them. Um, but I don't know if you had already opened a historic Brooklyn restaurant, maybe you were doing well from it. It might have attracted newer clientele. I mean, I saw some businesses that seemed to change with the times, or some that became like landmarks because Brooklyn was famous and they were now a famous location in Brooklyn. Uh, I guess one example you could say, there was like in Red Hook. Red Hook was near Sunset Park. It's a small neighborhood. Also experienced a lot of gentrification. I forgot to mention that earlier. Really a nice place. I mean, it's a kind of a unique part of Brooklyn. Maybe I'll have a podcast about that. I had a few great adventures there. Um, but yeah, you go all the way to the end of Red Hook, which had been like this other industrial neighborhood. Like you go all the way down, and there's this one guy who he sold just key lime pies, pretty much. His business was called Steve's, and I don't know. For me, I had heard he had been there already since 2000 or so, and I believe it became like a tourist destination. Like, hey, let's go to this one guy has a little shop who sells key lime pies. Um, and there were probably others like that. You had like where else? Brooklyn Navy Yard, Brooklyn Army Yard. These were places that changed with the times. You could say Brooklyn Navy Yard had been what it sounds like. It had been some kind of Navy installation. It dealt with ships and things like that. I guess the military, and it had become a place where a lot of new businesses, I think a lot of industrial businesses moved in. I remember once I was there, I visited a wood shop for potential job offer. So that was an example of a place that changed with the times. I think that's all I have to say about gentrification right now. It's a big topic, controversial topic, but I'll keep it at that right now. Subscribe to the channel, and I'm going to keep putting up more videos about Brooklyn in the 2010s. As I said, I was there. I went to every part of Brooklyn. I'm going to have videos about other parts of Brooklyn that are not as well known because I visited all of them. I'm going to take you on a tour of the whole borough. So stay tuned and keep up with it. Okay, that's all for tonight. Bye.